Francesca, thank you ever so much for saying that you'll take part in one of my conversations. This is great.
It's a pleasure, I hope.
I remember, this is ages ago now, this was the Compass weekend, year before last probably. We were talking about the good life, and you quoted that bit of Marx that says the good life is, and I can't even remember the order of it, but you'll remember it, but it's working in the morning and fishing in the afternoon and reading
and hunting, I think, goes in there somewhere, because I remember thinking, no, this wasn't written by a woman, and it was definitely not written for a vegetarian woman like me.
So translate that into the modern world, though, because we shan't be hunting and we probably shan't be doing much fishing, but what does the good life mean if you translate that into 2013?
Well, speaking personally, it means having space to think, to be, to have fun, to relax, as well as having stimulating work, as well as having good relationships and caring and loving relationships and time to care and love. But I think extrapolating from the personal, I suppose it means, just as Marx was trying to suggest, it means that everybody should have the resources to be able to pursue their own good life, which is a very interesting idea given the individualism implied in it from such a collectivist, some would say, state authoritarian figure as Marx.
For people on benefits and people with disabilities and people who are really struggling, how do they get those moments of peace and joy and social life and all the rest of it? I mean, is that something that you think we need to pay more attention to?
Well, this is where the Compass's good society is so attractive for someone like me, because to talk about the good life outside the context of the good society feels vacuous to me, even when I'm talking about my own life. There's a wonderful bit in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights where it talks about the individual only flourishing in the context of a wider community. So even there, in a human rights declaration, is the idea that the individual cannot pursue their own path outside the context of the society they're living in. So for me, when we're talking about people who have a much more pressurised and stressed life than I'm fortunate to have, one is talking immediately about what kind of society we live in. What are the preconditions for people to be able to pursue their own good life? And there's also a philosophical, if you like, assumption here. It's not just about economic conditions. It's not just about structural changes. It's actually about, I think, a sense of solidarity, a sense that you live in a place where, should you wish to, there is, fellow human beings around you who, through their goodwill, through relationships, can make your life better. And the part of your life being better is that you're giving and taking with others.
So one of the things that I've been talking about in these conversations is how, I'm a Londoner, you're a Londoner, how in a city like London, which is growing at the speed it's growing, which has 150 languages, however many languages spoken, has people coming from all corners of the globe, that the history of working class London was of a solidaristic community that was very collaborative and, invented lots of good shared services which were provided collectively. But it was also quite a defensive community, and it was sort of solidaristic against incomers sometimes and an underclass. That sort of solidarity feels like it is problematic now. How do we begin to think about the solidarity you're talking about, but in a much more diverse, pluralistic community?
I know that this is a current idea, and I'm not suggesting there isn't value to it, that greater diversity, there's a sort of equation, greater diversity equals weaker solidarity. And I'm not saying that's what you're saying, I'm saying that you're reflecting an idea that's out there. I'm not sure about that. First of all, I'm not sure that there isn't a mythical element to what you were describing, in that, communities have always bred tensions within them. For example, You know, the blokes might have gone down to the pub, and the women, you know, may have been, you know, enjoying those odd half an hour when they were on the doorstep with each other, but were mostly isolated. I don't, you know, I think there is a mythical element to that. There was once these strong communities, and now it's more. But also, I think that communities have never just been geographically based, and I mean, maybe once, but for a very long time now. It's not something very recent. Communities have been much more complex than that. You've always had, you know, communities of class, you've always had communities of gender, you've always had communities of faith, and all that you've done is had a gradual process where the sense of being in a community, if you like, for many people is diluted by the sense of being in lots of communities. And for me personally, who comes actually from a community, if you like, which is a North London Jewish community that I was brought up in, you know, it would be sheer hell if I didn't think I could choose to be in other communities as well. So I think that solidarity has to go with a sense of, if you like, the freedom to choose which communities you feel comfortable in. Otherwise it's not really solidarity, it's a kind of compulsion. And that might work for some people in the community, the ones who feel the most reflected by it or have the most power within it, but it's never worked for everyone. So I think the idea that you can sort of choose which communities you're comfortable in, and that there are different communities you can connect to depending on, you know, where you are in your life and you know, and you know, the journey of your life, and also you know, your different interests in life, is a positive thing. I don't see us as living in this atomised society that people describe. I do see there being tensions between groups, but there always were.
And is there a sense in which some communities, however, can be too closed, that actually it's dangerous, it's problematic if communities are simply, you know, an enclave of themselves and are not connected into wider society?
It depends. I mean, you know, there are. I used to live in Hackney for 20 odd years, and my parents stemmed from Hackney. You know, it was when I lived there in the 80s and 90s. It was described as the most diverse place in the UK. I don't know if that's still the case. Within that, you had a tremendous amount of, you know, harmony, if you like. There was very little racial tension or any other kind. The odd occasional sporadic issue, but you also had both open and closed communities. The Orthodox Jewish community massively kept to themselves, certain Muslim communities tended to keep to themselves. On the other hand, there was a mingling and a mixing that went on in certain forms, and that's what I'm sort of getting at. I'm not totally convinced by these kind of constructs that, you know, there were these hermetically sealed communities are all harmonious and now they're all. I think that this is an evolving process all the time, and you get elements of it all. I mean, I think the most dangerous factors for sense of solidarity are these, to my mind. Mm-hmm. One is vast inequality. You know, yes. To me that is a much greater threat to a sense of community or living within a community. So, you know, you've now got gated enclaves, which didn't really exist when we were growing up. You know, you have people that were living on some kind of estate, but you know, you have them within cities. You know, you've had this feature of our society where a certain class and stratified group, you know, just takes their children off, sometimes from the youngest age, to be educated only together. You know, you have concepts like white flight. There's too much diversity in an area. Certain people then leave it. To me, you know, these factors don't seem to feature very often or sufficiently often in discussions about what prevents a cohesive society. So I think more than anything else, vast inequality creates separateness, because then you don't even bump into each other. Whereas taking this description of Hackney, you had enclosed communities, if you like, but people were forced to bump into each other in the shops, on the buses, in the swimming pools or whatever. And so people rubbed along, and I don't see the problem with that.
Okay, so I'll come back to whether there's anything that anybody needs to do then about that, but let me follow the idea about inequality. If that is the most threatening form of diversity, I guess, the thing that we both need to do it's getting much more problematic in a democracy to tackle inequality because, I mean, I guess in 20s and 30s, most of the people were losers in inequality. And now, not everybody is convinced that they would be gainers from greater redistribution, either because of aspiration or and getting people to vote for greater redistribution seems to be a problem. Either it's a problem because they wouldn't support it, or it's a problem because nobody's brave enough to ask them. But what could we do? What should we do if inequality is the thing that most needs to be tackled? How do we solve that?
I'll be honest with you, but if I thought this was going to be filmed and put on a podcast and a website, I wouldn't say this to you. But as this is just between us, in my ideal world, I probably would, basically try to find a way of abolishing private schools in the form that they're in now, because I think it starts with children. That's not to say that I'm against thinking about diverse means of providing education, because I'm not opposed to that in principle. But what we call the public school system, which means that there is a whole elite who are educated separately from everyone else, sometimes from the youngest age, I think that is immensely problematic for our society. My understanding is it has very little replication in Europe.
Yes, no, I agree. I suppose the question is really, it's almost something about altruism. I mean, there are ways in which we can think about bringing different communities together. Ruth, I think, Lister was suggesting there's sort of horizontal diversity and there's vertical diversity. Ways in which you can think about bringing together different communities that are horizontally different in terms of a process of curiosity and engagement and fascination with each other and all the rest of it. Inequality and class difference is really about some people gaining at the expense of other people. That's not going to be solved by a process of fascinating curiosity. That's going to be solved by something much more difficult than that, unless, there is enough in a good society for the haves for them to be willing to rethink what it is to be a have in order to be part of a different world. And I suppose there's just the question is really, are we thinking about conventional politics in which actually we use the power of the state to take things off the haves in order to give it to the have-nots, and is that what, in which case you have to have a democratic majority to do that? Or are we thinking about changing the nature of what being a have is like so that there is more possibility of the middle classes upwards engaging?
I mean, one ambition that I was sympathetic to under New Labour was to make public services sufficiently attractive that people continue to meet each other in that context, because this is really what I'm suggesting is meeting points, although I do want to bring in other factors in a second, because this is not my main, if you like, my main focus. But as we're on this subject, I think that this whole choice agenda then got caught up in a discussion about whether choice means the choice to sort of opt out, or whether choice means that public services should be sufficiently diverse in the way they're provided that people are happy to opt in. I am actually persuaded that that people in the past, often at moments in time, develop a kind of wisdom that the generations that come after them should not simply discount and try and reconceive all over again. And I think there was a moment in time, if you like, and this is a very Eurocentric thing to say, at the French Revolution, for all the horrors that it produced, and that's another discussion about revolutions themselves, in thinking that there was something in that slogan, liberty, equality and fraternity or solidarity, that is worth retaining. Now, I know there are those these days who dismiss concepts like that as being abstract, and it's possible to do so. But I think there's a wisdom that I don't want to lose with the criticisms of those being abstract terms. Where am I going in saying this? I'm going to this place. I do believe it is really important when looking at issues like solidarity, that not only do you take into account the way that inequality can work against solidarity, but that liberty, the fact that human beings have an essential spirit that requires them to be able to make choices is not obliterated in the quest for solidarity, which is a long-winded way of saying I don't think the solution lies in a very heavy-handed, top-down state managerialism.
So we're not Leninists anymore.
We're not Leninists. I'm not sure I ever was. But I think one can still have a vision and try and persuade people to move towards it, and to see that, that moment of, great joy at, thinking you're going to be this multimillionaire, it can evaporate, as we've noticed, as we've seen, as we've observed in the course of a lifetime, in a moment. And that, when you don't have political parties or other bodies really putting a vision out there and trying to persuade people that there is a better kind of society to aim for, then there's absolutely no chance, in my view, of working towards it. Having said that, I've admitted that there are certain decisions that you have to make that might have authoritarian implications, and because I think childhood and the way we grow up is the most crucial, I think, because there is so much massive research to demonstrate that what happens when you're really young is still the most determinative element of how you are as an adult and what happens in your future life. I think there is a case for abolishing a kind of, the stratified education system that we have. So there's a place for Leninism, in other words.
So what are the characteristics of this good society? If we're going to make it possible for people to live the lives that you've described, and the society has got something to do to get there, what is it? What are the preconditions? What does this society have to be like?
Well, I think this might sound perverse given what I've just been saying, but I think the first thing is to recognise, the absolute magic that is a human being. That to really respect humanity. And my greatest discomfort with politics is how far away the conversation so quickly goes from human beings, and from being in touch with what it is that makes us human. I mean, that's what attracted me in my personal story to human rights, which was not a legal route whatsoever.
Oh, right.
Not at all, but a sort of ethical, if you like, spiritual connection with the idea, having been on the left for so many years and being constantly disappointed but also discomforted, between what I was involved in. I'm not putting myself outside it, that somehow the centre of gravity always seemed to be that one would move very quickly from saying the people, we're concerned about people, to never talking about people and not being able to differentiate between life experiences and not being human-centred. And human rights says, human rights, which is to debate, but that there's a whole history to human rights post-war which is not legalistic at all, but which is about philosophers looking at the human condition, if you like, and listening to the voices of people that have called for change, which is basically trying to be a corrector. It's not an anti-socialist or social democratic enterprise, but is a corrector of some of the worst horrors in the name of that enterprise, by saying we have to start with human beings and understand what it is to be human. What is the essence of being human? So my good society would be tailored on the human condition, and the human condition is that we need love to survive, we need relationships to survive, we have the capacity to care, we have a conscience, we need to feed that conscience, we need fun, all in addition to the obvious economic necessities, and we also have a spirit. So we mustn't deaden that spirit. We must allow people to use their creativity and their thinking and their, whether it's through sport or culture or, just relationships with each other, the capacity to talk. I mean, the fact that we can talk.
And it's funny because I come at this from a completely different direction, because what I'm doing in my job is quite often bringing people together from different sorts of backgrounds, or bringing managers together or politicians together, and creating space for a conversation or a dialogue that will take them somewhere different from where they started off, either solve problems or create a team or, bring people together to develop a shared strategy or whatever it is. And what astonishes me is the human intelligence, is when you let a whole human being come through rather than just, treat them like a brain on a stick or just want a sort of snapshot immediate impression. But if you actually say, here's the problem in all its complexity, let's work on it, actually human beings have got, anybody off the street has got the capacity to work on that problem with all their judgment and their emotion and their capability and their creative energies and come up with something that's a bloody good solution. And we did this project with older people where we were literally saying, okay, how would we make life better for older people so that you can live more independent lives with the resources we've got? There's no money. How do we use what we've got differently? And the generation of ideas was astonishing. And, I was supposed to be concentrating on facilitating, but I found myself just wondering at these human beings and thinking, my God, you're so wonderful. And yet that sense of wonder about another person, which is where the there's that sort of, I suppose, where I'm anxious about recession and bad times making us tribal in a bad sense, making us close off from each other, afraid of each other, threatened by each other, because it prevents that sense of fascination and wonder leading to something good. And and it may be that you think that's also overestimated.
Well, clearly that's happening, and I think there's every reason to be worried and frightened about it. It's what the root causes are. That's what concerns me. What I hear, what I hear as being a not necessarily totally explored assumption about what the root causes are. That it's, the more diversity you get, which is a theory that's around, the less solidarity you get. And to me, a good society wouldn't operate if it wasn't diverse. It wouldn't be a good society for me if it wasn't diverse in the first place. So it's kind of counterintuitive to me, for me personally, to say the resolution to create a good society is to be less diverse, when it wouldn't be a good society for me personally were it to be so.
Yeah. Okay.
So we have to look, and also I'm very familiar with these arguments that they come again and again and again, and I agree, of course, that they tend to emerge in times of stress, economic stress in particular, where somehow, however much diversity there is in that society, seems to be the problem. So right now we can quote, net migration to this country as having been, exceptionally large in the last period, as far as I know, ever. But when I was, say, working in a race charity with the Runnymede Trust in the 1980s, and we had net migration the other way, more people left the country than came, the exactly same arguments were made. Exactly the same. Swamping, people are rather afraid that we're being swamped by a different culture. Recognise that quote?
Yeah. Close-knit communities, for lots of us, actually the downside of a close-knit community is that you can't be different.
That's what I'm trying to say.
And you can't experiment with your life without everybody watching you.
Exactly.
And for lots of women and gay people and people from minority groups, a close-knit community can be a bit rough because the big city gives you options and freedom.
And some anonymity, which is, but also, very often in those communities, there are people with power for whom it's a good thing, or relative power, and others for whom it's not solidarity at all, it's compulsion. And, these are obvious common sense statements. So I don't see diversity as a threat to solidarity. But I also wanted to say that I also think there are counter trends anyway. So I do recognise that, there's local elections today. People are predicting that UKIP's going to do really well. There's a phenomenon all over Europe that we recognise from the past that's happening in the present of people turning against, newcomers, outsiders, etc. But I also think that there's a fantastically interesting generational interconnectedness. I can't make sense. I'm sure better brains than mine could make sense of the whole picture, because at the very moment that we're saying this, and I'm not exempting young people from that phenomenon, you've got this extraordinary thing called social networking, which is really only, it's much newer than the internet. It's really only about 10, 12 years old. And you've got young people in this new form of connectedness, which you could call solidarity. I think it is a form of solidarity, connecting with each other all the time without having to, be physically together. So it starts to challenge that whole notion that, solidarity requires a geographical place. Because actually, in social networking, it doesn't. But also doing so across boundaries of states, across the world, and over themes, and over, likes and dislikes.
What's I think exciting about the younger generation is that, in our generation of feminists, we had to define ourselves quite ferociously sometimes against the men, sometimes the men in our lives, but often the men in our workplaces, and we were quite often solidaristic against and in defence from. And actually the conversations we have in Compass, particularly with the younger men and women, there are as many young men involved in trying to think about how to change as there are young women. There's a greater generosity of spirit. Then people aren't so defended. I mean, it feels like if anything's moved on, it's that.
Well, also because, my daughter is in a feminist group in her sixth form, and, boys will say, I'm a feminist. I mean, therefore, feminism is now understood as not just simply, a form of women's liberation, but as a way of viewing the world. And that, that kind of self-expression, the kind of new ideas, new ways of looking at the same problems, which are not in opposition to, but just slightly different because they come from a different experience. I just think there's so much to feel positive about. I'm hearing all the time around me people feeling absolutely desperate about the situation, and there's no question about living standards, being hugely under pressure, and some people going right through the floor. But I do see lots and lots of pockets of hope, and one is that this capacity for young people to now be inventive, to use the inventiveness you referred to before, because partly of social networking and the whole technological revolution, and being attracted to using that for positive, good, if you like, not to be inward looking and hateful, but actually to take an old idea which was a bit separatist and is actually saying, no, it's expansionist now, is to me a sign that, that things move on, that we're not stuck, and that people are looking to improve their own lives and the world they live in all the time in spite of hard times.
So what does this mean for politics? What the danger in a sense is there's all this creativity going on everywhere except in the political parties, and somehow we're leaving them behind.
I think that is the case. I think that is true. That's why sort of orthodox politics is probably the most not boring, depressing place to be.
Maybe
it's heavy and it dampens the spirit that is still reflected all over the place. For example, how the crime figures have gone down. Now there are all sorts of theories about that, but one theory that I find convincing is this: what we're talking about now is that you don't need to have a youth club. You don't need to get your kicks from threatening someone down the street or hanging around when you've got, for not a great deal of money, the capacity to communicate with a whole load of people, or no doubt to watch images that I would find quite disturbing, but nevertheless less dangerous than what we're talking about, antisocial behaviour and worse, because there is a new spirit out there. And it's really possible to miss it, I think. It's really possible to be middle-aged, even young middle-aged, let alone, old middle-aged, late middle-aged and older, to miss that there's a parallel universe happening. Just like when we were young, the older generation didn't really know it was happening. Really didn't, until it was kind of too late.
So does this optimism mean that there's nothing that we need to worry about
of course not.
doing? Or
of course not.
What do we need to ask about politicians? What do we need to do in civil society? What role does the state have to play in any of this?
I was terribly excited when Frances O'Grady, the General Secretary of the TUC, the first ever woman, female General Secretary of the TUC, wrote that piece. It was just a piece in The Guardian, but it has, I think, gone viral, saying that basically the trade unions missed a trick in not understanding the importance of, if you like, co-production, co-management of the workplace. Not saying take over, but that trade unions need to have a place in the board, a place in the decision making. That ordinary working men and women need to be there as part of the whole culture and process of decision making at work. I mean, it's just an enormous, because the trade union movement stood against that, just as they stood against, I'm afraid, the minimum wage initially, because of its threat on collective bargaining. You remember all that. Why that's so important is because what that, to me, reflects is a different way of thinking about the way forward politically, if we're now talking strictly politically. That basically to open up the human creativity that you're talking about, That requires getting stuck in and being involved. Just ending that culture again of the 80s of the right to manage, and replacing it with the right to participate and the right to contribute, but also ending that culture which said that all change basically happens through basically, struggle, which is force of numbers and brute force.
Yes, and the bosses are always wrong, and
the bosses are always wrong, and
them.
if there's enough of us and we shout loud enough on the one hand, and the right to manage on the other, I think it's symbolic of a different way of looking at politics. That political change happens through engagement, through participation, through listening.
There's always a tension between what's fair and what's possible or sensible at a particular point in a democratic process.
Definitely.
And talking to John Craddock earlier on, there's sort of this question about the future in terms of the cuts in public services, and on the one hand it probably isn't fair that the public service has taken this great hit, which things that was caused by the banking system, and that's terribly unfair. But probably realistically that austerity will carry on whatever the government is like for some time to come, and simply saying all the cuts have to be reversed is not a sensible process. And actually there is a creativity, John was suggesting, that is about the release of some new ideas into a space where you haven't got enough money to do it any other way.
In a way, let's be honest, a lot of these ideas did emerge in the 1980s, and no doubt there's a long history before then, but they certainly were around in the 1980s when we had the cuts then.
Yes.
Some of these debates, were rehearsed at the time, and I was persuaded of all this then, and I'm utterly persuaded of it now. I think, though, where it became very uncomfortable under New Labour was that going back to where we started, that if that kind of creativity and lack of mindless obsession with the ownership issue rather than the outcome is not accompanied by a vision that looks at the whole of society, then you start to build up suspicion and resentment. So if it's a company with saying, extremely relaxed by, the rich, filthy rich, or whatever it was, what was the phrase? So misquoted so often that you only remember the misquotes.
Yes.
And without thinking through what the implications of that are, i.e. for a society that starts to be two nations, as Disraeli famously said, who hardly recognise each other, as he wrote in his book Sybil, actually, rather than said as a politician. That's when I think people get uneasy about this kind of... And one of the really interesting things, another reason why I feel relatively optimistic, that where Zeitgeist has begun to change, largely not through what any political party has done, although Labour under Ed Miliband's leadership is trying to use this focus on responsible capitalism, but really, I think, driven by UK Uncut and Occupy, and other protests, this whole debate now about tax,
Yes.
I mean, this just, there was only one thing you could say about tax for about 25 years, which is that it needed to be reduced for the very rich. And now there's a massive discussion about who pays tax and how much tax, and so I think you can have these conversations that you're describing now about the way public services are provided and the sheer obvious self-evidence that these cuts are not going to be restored in the foreseeable future, and certainly not in their entirety, provided you're looking at the whole picture.
So if you had a wish list, if you had 2 or 3 things that could happen in the world that would get us closer to your good society, that perhaps Mr. Miliband or leaders of other political parties might listen to, but what is it that we need to do now?
Well, I think one is that is a big, huge issue we haven't actually touched on, and I enjoy my comforts as much as anyone else. But one is that we get really real about the fact that the resources of our world are not limitless, and that this is part of every single conversation. Because although I am not an economist, and that must show in everything I say, and I know that that there is plenty of possibilities of a kind of form of growth through a green economy that is not, there's that whole debate. Nevertheless, there is an assumption all the time in these debates about growth. That the simple issue is how do we get more infinitely, and that is actually not the reality. And I don't think, just having more and more, being richer and richer and more choice breeds a good society and happiness. I just don't. Let alone the fact that it's not sustainable, and for future generations it's all going to end in the most terrible despair. And the reality that right now there are parts of the world that are being affected by the fact that we are so life is so plentiful for so many of us here. So I would like a sense of kind of time and place, a sense of humility, if you like. The second thing is, I suppose, a more parochial issue, which is, it's not my issue anymore. But I will never forget what it was like to suddenly feel as an equal human being, that I had this whole responsibility as a parent, which made my life completely different to anyone that wasn't. And that the sort of new Labour answer to that was, I know, give your child away, or rather, I'll give you subsidies for childcare. And that is not, I think, a complete answer at all. It is an element of an answer, but it has its place. In other words, what I'm really trying to say is that I don't think we've begun to really resolve the issue. And the same thing applies when you have, and I know, when you have an elderly relative, or people who have relatives or friends who are ill or with disabilities, how we build care into our
and we haven't
politics.
got the balance of work and care right.
We haven't got it right at all. And I who fought for childcare actually get really, really irritated every time I hear that, because really it's not childcare. What they're saying is a means for you to go out to work, but no one's resolving the childcare issue, which is how we care for our children and for everybody else at other stages in life where they need that.
Thank you, Francesca. That's been really great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you. Lovely talking to you as ever.